She was just the cook, a woman who measured her days in scoops of flour and the simmering of stock pots, never knowing that the quiet, dust-caked cowboy she served owned every inch of the land they stood on, every blade of scorched grass, every groaning timber of the house she worked in. He was a shadow who had ridden in on the dusk, a man with eyes that held the deep, bruised color of a storm-heavy sky, and she had treated him as she treated them all, with a weary indifference that was its own kind of armor. Before we get into this tale, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and subscribe if you want more content like this one. His name was Elias, though he offered none, and none was asked for. He simply appeared at the ranch house door, his frame lean but solid, etched by sun and wind into something that looked more like the unyielding landscape than a man made of flesh and blood. Ilara, her hands perpetually white with dough, had looked him up and down, her gaze lingering for a moment on the careful way he held himself, a stillness that seemed out of place in a drifter. But the foreman, a florid man named Brody whose authority was worn like an ill-fitting coat, had already sized him up and grunted an affirmative. They needed another hand, desperately. So Ilara had ladled a thin stew into a chipped bowl and slid it across the rough-hewn table without a word. He had taken it with a quiet nod, his fingers calloused and scarred, and eaten with a slow, deliberate pace that felt more like a ritual than a meal. From his seat, he could see out the open kitchen door to the rolling expanse of brown hills, a kingdom gasping for rain. He saw the rot in the fence posts near the corral, the way the horses' ribs showed too plainly, the weary slump of the barn's roof. He saw the neglect not with the critical eye of a stranger, but with the hollow ache of a son returning to a dilapidated inheritance. This was his, all of it. The thought was not a boast but a burden, a heavy stone in his gut that the thin stew did nothing to dislodge. He was here to listen to the land's heartbeat, to feel its sickness in his own bones before he ever announced his name. Ilara watched him from the corner of her eye as she scrubbed a cast-iron skillet with furious energy. She saw the way his gaze drifted past her, past the kitchen, and fixed on the horizon, his expression unreadable, a mask of dust and quiet sorrow. She had seen countless men pass through this kitchen, their hunger a raw, simple thing, but his hunger felt different. It was older, deeper, a famine of the soul that no meal she could cook would ever satisfy. She turned away, the scraping of metal on metal filling the silence. He was just another stray, another mouth to feed in a long line of them. It was better not to wonder. Wondering was a luxury this life did not afford. The first light of dawn broke across the plains like a pale, watery yolk, spilling over the parched earth. Elias was already up, moving with a silent efficiency that was unsettling to the other hands. He didn't speak, just listened to Brody's gruffly issued orders, his head cocked slightly as if he were listening to two conversations at once, the foreman's loud, blustering commands and the quieter, more urgent whispers of the land itself. The day's work was mending the southern fence line, a task that was as much about wrestling with brittle, sun-bleached wood and rusted wire as it was about building a barrier. The other men, a pair of weathered cowhands named Hank and Cole, worked with a practiced but joyless rhythm, their movements full of complaint and shortcuts. They regarded Elias with a mixture of suspicion and pity, the way settled animals look at a lone wolf passing through their territory. They made assumptions based on the color of his skin and the quiet set of his jaw, pegging him as a man running from something, a man with no stake in the world. They were wrong on every count. He wasn't running from anything. He was running toward the heart of a problem he was not yet ready to name. He worked methodically, his hands sure and strong. When a post refused to set in the hard-packed caliche, he didn't curse it or beat it with the mallet as Hank did. He knelt, scooping out the dirt with his bare hands, feeling the texture of the soil, reading its composition. He found a line of softer earth a few feet away, an old forgotten wash, and set the post there, sighting it with his eye until it stood as true as a church steeple. From the kitchen window, her view framed by wilting herbs on the sill, Ilara watched. She saw the incident with the fence post. She saw how Brody barked at him for wasting time, and how Elias simply straightened up, wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of a dusty glove, and moved on to the next post without a word of defense. She saw the way he approached a skittish mare later in the day, not with a rope and a threat, but with a low murmuring sound and a slow, outstretched hand. His patience a stark contrast to the rough handling the other men employed. A flicker of something, not respect, not yet, but a grudging acknowledgement, stirred in her. There was a competence in him, a deep-running current of knowledge that the foreman's bluster couldn't touch. Elias felt her gaze on him, a faint pressure on the back of his neck. He didn't turn to meet it. He was focused on the task at hand, the physical labor a necessary penance, a way of reintroducing himself to the land he had been separated from for so long. Every splintered post he replaced was a broken promise he was trying to mend. Every coil of new wire was a line of communication he was trying to reestablish with his father's legacy. The sun beat down, a merciless hammer, but he welcomed the searing heat. It was honest. It was real. Unlike the men around him, the land did not lie. That evening, the air in the bunkhouse was thick with the smell of sweat, leather, and the low-grade resentment of overworked men. Elias entered last, long after the sun had bled out behind the hills. He moved toward the kitchen, expecting the leftovers to be cold, if there were any at all. He didn't expect to find Ilara still there, a single lantern casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. She was sitting at the table, a small, leather-bound book open in her hands, though she wasn't reading. Her gaze was distant. A plate sat on the table before her empty chair, covered by another. Steam ghosted from its edges. He stopped in the doorway, an intruder in her quiet moment. She looked up, her expression guarded, but her eyes in the soft lamplight seemed to have lost some of their hardness. "You're late," she said. It wasn't an accusation, just a statement of fact. There was a break in the northern line by the creek bed. His voice was raspy from dust and disuse. She nodded slowly, pushing the plate toward him. "Eat." It was a command, but it was softer than the one she had given the day before. He sat uncovering the plate. It was a larger portion than he'd received before, the stew richer, with more meat than potato. A piece of cornbread, golden and warm, sat beside the bowl. It was a gesture, a small crack in the fortress of her indifference. They sat in a silence that was different from the one before. It was no longer empty, but filled with unspoken questions. He ate, and she watched him, her book forgotten in her lap. "Where are you from?" she finally asked, the question slipping out as if it had a will of its own. He chewed slowly, considering his answer. The truth was too large, too unbelievable. A lie felt like a betrayal of the strange, fragile truce forming between them. "I was born not far from here," he said, which was true. "But I've been away a long time. What brought you back?" The question was bolder, and she almost seemed to regret it as soon as it was spoken. He looked up from his plate, his dark eyes meeting hers for the first time without a barrier of dust or duty between them. "A promise," he said, the words simple and heavy. In that moment, a memory, sharp and sudden as a shard of glass, pierced the veil of his exhaustion. He was a boy, no older than 10, standing on the porch of this very house. His father's hand, broad and warm, rested on his shoulder. The air was sweet with the smell of imminent rain, a scent so potent it was almost a taste. "This land, it speaks, Elias," his father had said, his voice a low rumble. "You just have to be quiet enough to hear it. You promise me you'll always listen." The memory faded, leaving an ache in its place. He looked at Ilara, at the wary curiosity in her eyes, and saw a woman who was also listening, who was bound to this place by forces she may not even understand. She was listening for the footfalls of hope, or perhaps just for the sound of the other shoe dropping. The next day, the fragile piece of the routine was broken by whispers. Elias was oiling a saddle in the relative cool of the barn when he heard Brody's voice, low and conspiratorial, drifting from the tack room. He was talking to Hank, the more cynical of the two cowhands. Elias stilled his hands, his body becoming just another shadow among the hanging leather and hay bales. "Croft was in town again yesterday," Brody said, his voice a greasy murmur, asking about the place. "Says the owner hasn't responded to his last 3 offers. He's getting impatient." "What's the owner like, anyway?" Hank asked, spitting a stream of tobacco juice. "Nobody knows," Brody scoffed. "Some fella from back east who inherited it. Never set foot on the place, far as anyone can tell. Probably doesn't even know a horse from a mule. Just lets it sit and rot while he collects the checks." The irony was so thick Elias could have choked on it. He, the man they spoke of with such disdain, was just feet away. his hands smelling of the very leather they used to work the land he supposedly neglected. "Croft's offer is looking better every day," Brody continued. "This place is bleeding out. Another dry season like this one, and there won't be anything left to sell. If I could get a message to the owner, I'd tell him to take the money and run." Elias felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. This wasn't just neglect, it was a siege. Silas Croft, the neighboring baron, was a man whose greed was as vast as the Texas sky. He had been buying up smaller, struggling ranches for years, consolidating his power, bleeding the land dry for quick profit before moving on. Elias's father had despised him. Now Croft was circling his legacy, and the man entrusted to protect it, his own foreman, was ready to hand him the keys. He heard the scrape of a bucket from the direction of the main house. Ilara. She was at the water pump just outside the barn, her back to the tack room, but her posture was rigid. She pumped the handle with a stiff, jerky motion, her head bowed. She was hearing it all. Her world, her job, her small, precarious place in the order of things, was tied to the fate of this ranch. Her worry was a palpable thing, another scent on the dry air, mingling with the hay and the manure. Elias's purpose, which had been a heavy stone, now sharpened into a blade. He was no longer just here to listen. He was here to fight. He had to know who was loyal to the land and who was loyal only to the promise of a paycheck from the highest bidder. The whispers had told him everything he needed to know about his foreman. Now he needed to test the others. He needed to test the heart of the ranch itself. The test came not from a man, but from the earth itself. A week of relentless baking sun had cracked the land into a mosaic of thirst. The main well, the lifeblood of the ranch, began to draw up more mud than water, its steady gurgle slowing to a choked, desperate gasp. Panic, a dry and dusty cousin to fear, began to spread through the bunkhouse. Brody gathered the men, his face flushed, his usual bluster replaced by a thin veneer of command that cracked under pressure. "We'll have to ration," he announced, his voice too loud. "Half rations for the stock. We'll have to drive them to the North Pasture Creek." Cole, the more pragmatic hand, shook his head. "That creek's barely a trickle, Brody. It won't support the whole herd, and that's a 2-day drive for the weaker ones. We'll lose cattle." The men murmured in agreement, their faces grim. Brody's authority was crumbling, revealing the hollow foundation beneath. He had no answers, only orders that led to a slower, more certain ruin. In the tense silence that followed, Elias stepped forward. He didn't address Brody. He spoke to the men, his voice quiet but carrying a strange weight of certainty. "There's water," he said as closer. Brody rounded on him, his fear lashing out as anger. "What do you know, Drifter? You've been here 5 minutes. I've worked this land for 10 years. "Then you should know about the old spring in the western hollow," Elias replied, his gaze steady, unwavering. "The one your fences have cut off for years, the one fed by the deep aquifer, not the surface runoff." A confused silence fell over the group. Hank and Cole exchanged a look of disbelief. Brody's face went from red to a blotchy white. He had no idea what Elias was talking about. A spring? It was the stuff of legend, a story the old-timers used to tell. No one had seen it in a generation. "You're lying," Brody stammered. "There's no spring." Elias didn't argue. He simply turned and walked toward the stables, grabbing a shovel and a pickaxe as he went. "The cattle are thirsty," he said over his shoulder. "They don't care about lies." A moment of hesitation, and then Cole, followed by a reluctant Hank, went after him. They would follow a madman with a plan over a fool with none. From the kitchen doorway, Ilara watched the small procession head west, a lone, dark figure leading the way. She had seen the panic in Brody's eyes and the quiet, unnerving confidence in Elias's. It wasn't the confidence of a gambler. It was the certainty of a man reading a map only he could see. For hours they dug, following Elias's uncanny directions, clearing away years of rockfall and overgrown mesquite in a shallow, forgotten ravine. And then they found it, a dark, damp patch of earth, a trickle of water that, as they dug deeper, became a steady, clear, cold flow. It was a miracle. The men stared, their faces a mixture of awe and suspicion. How did you know?" Hank breathed, looking at Elias as if he were something not entirely human. Elias leaned on his shovel, his chest heaving, his face caked in mud. He looked at the water, a dark mirror reflecting the vast blue sky. "The land told me," he said softly. That night the air in the kitchen was charged with a new kind of silence. The miracle of the spring had shifted the very ground beneath their feet, altering the landscape of power and perception on the ranch. The men who had once dismissed Elias now regarded him with a wary respect. They gave him a wide berth, as if his knowledge were a contagious, dangerous thing. Brody, on the other hand, seethed with a venomous mixture of humiliation and suspicion, his glares promising a reckoning. Elias sat at the kitchen table, nursing his sore muscles, when Alara approached. She moved without a sound, her presence a soft counterpoint to the harshness of the day. In her hands, she held 2 mugs. She placed one in front of him, the rich, dark aroma of real coffee, not the weak, boiled grain substitute she served the other hands, rising to meet him. It was the coffee she kept hidden for herself, a small, private luxury. It was an offering, a peace treaty, a question. "You saved them," she said, her voice barely a whisper. She didn't say us. She said them, referring to the cattle, to the land itself. It was a subtle, crucial distinction. He looked up at her, at the genuine confusion and awe in her eyes. "The land saved itself," he replied, his voice low. "It always does. You just have to listen." He was repeating his father's words, and the echo of that long-ago promise resonated in the small kitchen. Alara wrapped her hands around her own mug, seeking its warmth. "My father was the cook here before me," she said, her gaze drifting toward the window, toward the darkening land. "He used to talk about the old ways, about listening. I thought they were just stories." "They're never just stories," Elias said. A different memory surfaced, this one more painful, the edges sharper. He was a young man, barely 18, standing by his father's bedside. The room smelled of sickness and linseed oil. His father's hand, once so strong, was a pale, bony thing clutching his. "Don't sell it, Elias," his father had rasped, his voice a dry rustle of leaves. "Don't ever let them take it. They'll bleed it dry. They don't understand it. They don't love it, promise me. Promise me you'll be its shepherd, not just its master." Elias had promised, the word a brand on his soul. That promise had driven him away, to learn the world of finance and law, the white man's weapons, so he could protect his inheritance from behind their own desks. And that same promise had brought him back, not as a lawyer in a suit, but as a cowboy covered in the dirt of the land he was sworn to protect. He looked across the table at Alara. He saw in her a reflection of his own purpose, a quiet, steadfast caretaker, bound to this place by history and love. The cook, the heart of the home, the keeper of its quiet truths. The boundary between them, once a chasm, was now just a line drawn in the dust, easily blurred, easily crossed. The arrival of Silas Croft's carriage was an intrusion of polished wood and arrogant steel in the rustic, struggling landscape. It kicked up a cloud of dust that seemed to coat everything in a film of entitlement. Croft himself descended like a king visiting a backwater province, a large man whose expensive suit couldn't hide the predatory stillness in his eyes. He was the vulture Elias had been expecting, come to pick at the bones of the ranch he thought was already dead. He strode toward the main house, his gaze sweeping over the property with an owner's possessiveness, completely ignoring the handful of ranch hands who had stopped their work to watch. He saw Brody scurrying out to meet him, his posture obsequious, his hat crushed in his hands. Elias, who had been reshoeing a horse near the barn, straightened up slowly, his face impassive. He watched the exchange, the powerful man and his willing subordinate. Croft clapped Brody on the shoulder, a gesture that was more of a brand than a greeting. "Brody," Croft's voice boomed, carrying easily on the dry air. "Any word from our mysterious benefactor? Has he decided to take my very generous offer yet?" "Not yet, Mr. Croft," Brody said, his voice fawning. "But the place is on its last legs. The well ran dry. He'll have to sell soon. It's only a matter of time." Elias felt a cold anger rise in him. Brody hadn't mentioned the spring. He was actively concealing the ranch's greatest asset to grease the wheels of its sale. At that moment, Croft's dismissive gaze finally landed on Elias. It lingered for a second, taking in his dark skin, his dusty clothes, his quiet stillness. Croft's lip curled in a faint sneer. He gestured with his thumb. "Who's this?" "Just a new hand, sir," Brody said quickly. "Drifter." We were short-staffed. Croft looked Elias up and down again, a flicker of irritation in his eyes. "Well, see that he looks busy. I don't pay for idle hands on my prospective properties." Elias met Croft's gaze. He didn't flinch. He didn't speak. He simply held the powerful man's stare, and in that silent challenge, the air grew thick and heavy. He saw Alara standing in the kitchen doorway, a dishcloth frozen in her hand, her face a pale mask of apprehension. She was watching this confrontation, this silent clash of wills between the man who would devour the land and the man who was its secret guardian. Elias then did something that made Brody's blood run cold. He spoke, his voice calm and even, directly to the land baron. "The well didn't run dry," he said. "We just opened up the old spring, the one in the western hollow, waters running clearer than ever." The effect was instantaneous. Croft's arrogant composure fractured. His eyes narrowed, suspicion and fury warring in his face. He turned on Brody. "Spring? What spring?" Brody began to stammer, his betrayal laid bare for all to see. But Croft's attention snapped back to Elias. A simple hand shouldn't know this. A simple hand wouldn't dare to speak to him this way. "You have a smart mouth for a field hand," Croft snarled, taking a step toward him. Maybe too smart. Elias didn't move. He just stood his ground, a silent, immovable object against an unstoppable force. And in that moment, everyone watching knew this was more than just an argument. It was a battle for the soul of the ranch itself. The tension on the porch had coiled into a venomous knot. Silas Croft, his face a mask of purple fury, felt his authority being challenged by a man he considered less than the dust on his boots. This quiet, inscrutable cowboy had not only exposed Brody's deceit, but had also spoken with a knowledge of the land that was both baffling and infuriating. It was an affront to the natural order of things, as Croft understood it. His world was built on a clear hierarchy of power, money, and race, and Elias was violating all of it with his calm, steady gaze. "I've had enough of this," Croft spat, his voice shaking with rage. He rounded on the cowering foreman. "Brody, get this boy off this ranch. Now. I want him gone before the sun sets. Consider it your first official duty when this property becomes mine." Brody, desperate to regain Croft's favor, puffed out his chest and turned to Elias, his face a pathetic imitation of authority. "You heard him. Pack your things and get out, you're fired." But Elias didn't move. He didn't even look at Brody. His gaze lifted, moving past the enraged land baron, past the dilapidated porch, and settled on the distant horizon, where the soft brown hills met the endless blue sky. He looked at the land as if it were the only thing in the world that mattered. A strange, serene calm settled over his features. The sounds of the ranch, the nicker of a horse, the cry of a hawk, the worried murmuring of the other hands, seemed to fall away into a profound silence. Then he spoke. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the tension with the clean, sharp finality of a falling axe. "You can't fire a man from his own home." The words hung in the hot, still air, incomprehensible. Brody blinked. Croft let out a short, contemptuous laugh. "His home? This drifter?" Elias slowly turned his gaze from the horizon and met Croft's eyes. Without breaking contact, he reached into the inner pocket of his worn vest and pulled out a small oilskin pouch. From it, he carefully extracted a piece of paper, folded and worn soft along the creases. He stepped forward, his boots making a soft thud on the wooden porch, and laid the paper on a weathered rain barrel that stood between them. He smoothed it out with his palm. It was a deed. The lettering, though faded, was clear and precise, and at the bottom, the name of the proprietor was written in a strong, elegant script, Elias Washington. A collective, silent gasp seemed to be sucked from the air. Brody's jaw fell slack, his face draining of all color as the name registered. The same name as the long-dead owner. The same name as the mysterious heir he had been maligning for months. The other hands stared, their minds struggling to reconcile the man they knew, the quiet worker, the mender of fences, the finder of water, with the name on that paper. Croft's laugh died in his throat, replaced by a choking sound of disbelief. He leaned forward, his eyes scanning the document, his arrogance crumbling like a sandcastle against a rising tide. And Alara, watching from the kitchen doorway, felt the world tilt on its axis. Every small gesture, every cryptic word, every act of quiet competence suddenly clicked into place with a stunning, heart-stopping clarity. The stew she had served him, the bedroll in the bunkhouse, the way he looked at the land not as a visitor, but as a long-lost lover. He wasn't just a cowboy. He was the king who had returned to his kingdom in the guise of a pauper. The immediate aftermath was a tableau of shattered certainties. Silas Croft stood frozen for a long moment, staring at the deed as if it were a serpent coiled on the barrel. Then, with a strangled cry of pure, undiluted rage, he snatched the paper, his eyes darting over it one last time as if hoping it was a forgery, a trick. But the county seal, the surveyor's marks, the signature, they were all undeniably authentic. His face contorted, the mask of civility completely gone, revealing the raw, ugly avarice beneath. "This changes nothing," he snarled, his voice a venomous hiss. "You may have the paper, but you don't have the coin. This place is worthless and you're a fool sitting on a pile of dust. I'll be back. I'll wait until you starve and I'll buy this land for pennies." He threw the deed back onto the barrel and stormed toward his carriage, shouting for his driver, his departure a whirlwind of impotent fury. The dust he kicked up seemed less arrogant now, more like a desperate retreat. An immense, unnerving silence descended in his wake. All eyes turned to Elias, then to Brody. The foreman was shaking, his face a pale, sweaty canvas of terror. He opened his mouth to speak, to stammer an excuse or a plea, but Elias raised a hand and the sound died in his throat. Elias's voice, when he finally spoke, was devoid of anger or triumph. It was as calm and final as a judge's sentence. "Pack your things, Brody," he said. "Be gone by morning." There was no room for argument. Brody just nodded, a broken man, and shuffled away toward the bunkhouse, his authority stripped from him as easily as shedding a snake's skin. Elias then turned to the other hands, Hank and Cole, who stood rooted to the spot, their faces a mixture of fear and dumbfounded awe. "The work is the same," Elias told them, his voice even. "The land still needs mending, but the pay will be fair. You'll work for this ranch, not just on it. If you choose to stay, you'll be treated with respect. If you choose to go, I'll pay you what you're owed." He was not making a grand speech about a new world order. He was simply stating new terms, a foundation built on dignity rather than dominance. He was offering them a stake in their own labor. After a moment of shared silent consideration, Cole gave a short, decisive nod. Hank followed a second later. The crisis had forged a new, uncertain loyalty. Elias picked up the deed, folded it carefully, and tucked it back into his vest. His gaze swept over his land, his home, before finally settling on the kitchen doorway. Alara was still standing there, the dishcloth clutched in her hand like a rosary. Her world had been turned inside out. The power dynamic, the very structure of her existence, had been inverted in a single, breathtaking moment. Shame, hot and sharp, pricked at her for the way she had first treated him, for her dismissive judgment. It was followed by a wave of awe, and beneath it all, a fragile, unfamiliar feeling began to unfurl in her chest. Hope. Elias walked toward the house, his steps measured. He entered the kitchen, his domain now in title as well as in spirit. He didn't loom over her or crowd her space. He simply stood on the other side of the room near the hearth, granting her the silence she needed to recalibrate her universe. The air between them was thick with everything that had happened, and everything that was about to change. A week passed. A quiet, purposeful rhythm began to settle over the Washington ranch, replacing the tense, frayed energy that had preceded it. The sun still beat down and the land was still thirsty, but the despair had lifted. It was replaced by the steady sound of hammers on fence posts, the lowing of cattle drinking from the clear, cool spring, and the quiet camaraderie of men who knew what they were working for. Elias was not a master who oversaw from a shaded porch. He was a leader who led from the front lines. He rose before the sun and worked alongside Hank and Cole, his hands as dirty as theirs, his sweat watering the same soil. He was teaching them not just how to mend fences, but how to read the land, how to see the subtle shifts in the grass that spoke of water, how to understand the language of the wind. He was rebuilding more than just a ranch. He was restoring its soul, teaching them to be shepherds as his father had taught him. The men responded to his quiet authority with a deep, unspoken respect. The ranch was coming back to life. Ilara felt the change in the heart of the house. The food she cooked seemed to taste better, seasoned with a newfound sense of security. The bread rose higher. The kitchen, once her refuge and her prison, now felt like the genuine center of a home. She still worked with the same tireless dedication, but the weariness in her bones had been replaced by a sense of purpose that mirrored the one she saw in the man who was now her employer. She still caught herself watching him from the window, but her perspective had been irrevocably altered. She no longer saw a drifter, but a guardian, a man carrying the weight of a legacy with a grace and strength that humbled her. Late one afternoon, as the day's heat began to soften into the golden glow of evening, Elias came to the kitchen. He didn't come for a meal. The men had eaten an hour earlier. He came for her. She was wiping down the long wooden table, her movements slow and methodical. He stopped in the doorway, just as he had on that first night, but now the space between them was charged with a different meaning. "Ilara," he said, his voice quiet. She stopped her work but didn't turn around immediately. She took a breath, composing herself, then faced him. "Mr. Washington," she replied, the name still feeling foreign and formal on her tongue. A faint, sad smile touched his lips. "Elias," he corrected gently. He walked further into the room, stopping a few feet from her. "I wanted to explain," he began, "why I came back this way in secret." She listened, her eyes fixed on his face, seeing the exhaustion and the resolve etched there. "This land, it's more than just property to me," he said, his gaze drifting for a moment to the window. "It has a spirit, a memory. I couldn't come back as its owner until I knew its heart. I had to know the people who lived on it. I had to know who was loyal to the place and who was just loyal to the money. I had to feel its sickness before I could try to heal it." His confession was simple, honest, and profound. It laid bare the core of his character. She finally understood the depth of his burden and the reason for his deception. "I'm sorry," she said, her own voice soft but clear, "for how I treated you. When you first arrived, I didn't see. Nobody was meant to," he answered, his voice full of a quiet grace that absolved her completely. "You saw a tired, hungry man. You gave him food. You were not unkind." In his words, she heard not just forgiveness but a deep, resonant understanding. He had seen her, too. He had seen past her own armor of indifference. The final barrier between them dissolved, leaving not romance, but a foundation of profound mutual respect. They stood together in the quiet kitchen, the cook and the cowboy, the caretaker and the owner, and looked out the window at the land. It was his by name, but it was theirs to rebuild. The future was a vast, unwritten territory, but for the first time in a long time, it felt less like a threat and more like a promise, stretching out before them under the endless Texas sky.